Geo arbitrage. What is it? Why does it exist? And when does it work out well for clients? Stay with me. So, I got a very interesting question in the comments section about someone who intended to retire abroad. And this is actually a very common point of conversation, especially among my Generation X clients about the prospects of retirement abroad. I have this conversation at least 3 times a week with people. And it usually goes like this. Hey, I'm getting older. I'm in my 40s or 50s. I'm starting to think more seriously about retirement. I want to see what opportunities there are, particularly to retire either outside the US or even retire in another state. And I have clients who are in the silent generation or baby boomer generation that have indeed retired abroad. And it's often a more complicated prospect than I think many people understand. And in addition to retirement abroad, there is the whole nomad visa, nomad worker, basically a person who doesn't have to show up in an office or doesn't have to show up in an office very often, who has the opportunity of living somewhere else in the world or in the nation with strong internet access and working remotely full time. I myself have lived abroad for several years at a time. I lived in Europe for several years, and I have spent considerable stints of time abroad. 4 years when I was younger, 6 months, etc. And there are things that I think people really need to consider when thinking about a life abroad before they make the ultimate decision to go in that direction. And I will say, when I'm talking to someone about a life abroad and they're like baby boomers right on the verge of retirement, after learning all the facts, about half the people will actually attempt it or will go through with it to some extent. And half the population who talks about retirement abroad will ultimately be like, I looked into it and this isn't what I thought it was going to be, or it isn't quite what I want. So I'm not going to do it. So I do encourage everyone who is considering this direction to make an informed decision and then decide to make their move abroad, whether they're doing digital nomad or they're doing retirement. And I'm going to give you a few points of consideration for moving abroad. First things first, when moving abroad, you have to consider that most people who move abroad, either for retirement or for digital nomad, do eventually come back to the US. They do it for an experience, they do it for a year or two, or they do it for several years, but they do make the decision to come back to the US at some point. Often the first consideration is stuff. If you own a house, are you going to keep your house here in the US? Are you going to sell it? And all the furniture, clothing, cars, content, what exactly are you going to do with that? I've had both things happen where I've literally sold everything, including the car, and gone abroad. And I've had situations where I've placed my items in storage and I've had very differing results. When you sell everything, including your car, and you go abroad, it's great. It's very liberating to like liquidate your life and take it down to like 2 suitcases and a one-way ticket to a foreign country. However, it makes it really hard when you come back to the US because you have liquidated everything. You basically have to start off at ground zero. For the period of time where I put things in storage, that was great, but storage becomes very expensive. And one thing I will say, there is a big difference between climate controlled storage and non-climate controlled storage. If you're storing furniture, books, clothing, etc., I really strongly suggest that you get climate controlled storage because it can get very hot, very cold, it can get very humid, and those things often ruin things like clothing and furniture. So I would suggest looking into climate control storage. But storage was ultimately very expensive. It started off at one price and then jumped to another price. I put a car in storage, and when I came to get that car out of storage, the battery had died and required a lot of maintenance to get the car back in operation. On some level, I wish I had just sold the car instead of putting it in a storage unit. So you do have to consider, as a first option, what are you going to do with your life here in the US? Are you going to sell everything? Are you going to put everything in storage? Are you going to do a hybrid? Like you put everything in storage for a year, and then if you're still abroad, you'll come back and clear out the storage and sell it. But how important is stuff in your home and your car and other things to yourself? The second thing I will say about life abroad, especially for retirement, it takes several years of planning. It's not just, sell everything, get on a plane and go. It takes anywhere from 3 to 5 years of planning to make this happen. And typically, when someone is nearing retirement age and has expressed an interest in a country and retiring abroad, I tell them they need to spend some time in that country. Maybe they'll go there and spend a month or 3 months, and not just once. You want to do it repeatedly, right? Because you don't want to see it through the eyes of a tourist. You want to see it through the eyes of a local. And the only way you're going to do that is if you go there repeatedly, you go during different times of the year, and you go to different parts of the country. So I suggest spending several years, successive years, spending vacation time there, spending months there if you can, and go during different times of the year so you can see kind of all seasons weather in that country. The next thing I would say is you need to learn language. If you're going to, let's say, Mexico, and something that I thought was really fascinating is the country with the largest American population outside of the US is actually Mexico. We have a very special connection to Mexico, and oftentimes the media portrays it as something else, but there are a lot of Americans that live and work in Mexico, right? If you're going to live in Mexico or a Spanish-speaking country or Thailand or Philippines, I really advocate that you need to learn the language. You need to learn as much of the language as you can while you are visiting or before you arrive. It will help you out immensely. And if you really want to commit to this plan, if you really think you're going to spend your retirement in, Mexico or Spain, and, you're committing to spending several months or several years there, take some language classes, learn the language. It'll help you get by a lot easier if you are fluent in the local language. The next thing I would tell a person, you need to start building community in that country because you are moving across the world, right? And your entire network is changing, right? One thing I learned about my own experience of living abroad, oftentimes international communities of Americans, and you often end up connecting with other Americans abroad because it's a feeling of safety and security, familiarity, and home. But oftentimes, communities can be very transient. There's people moving in, there's people moving out, there's people moving around. And so it becomes really difficult to build those very important, multi-year or lifetime connections you need to feel really rooted in an experience. And so sometimes you can find communities of people who've been there for decades, but sometimes it's very difficult to make those connections with people. And honestly, those are the people who are going to help you out and pull you through when things get difficult. Those are the people who know how the system works. Those are the people who are going to hook you up and give you the connections you need to make it work. So oddly enough, even when you move abroad or you have an experience with a digital nomad or retirement abroad, you're going to spend a lot of time finding Americans and running across Americans and building connections with Americans. I spent a total of about 5 years abroad. I can count the number of local friends that I made, like people who are really friends who I remained in contact with, probably on both hands. Everybody else was American because I felt I needed that, and I did need that as a foreigner in a different country. The next thing, once you've built out your community and once you've built out your network, you're going to need these people because you're going to have to ask yourself several questions. You're going to have to build out your professional network in a foreign country. First of all, who's going to be your doctor? How does the medical system run there? Do you have to buy health insurance to live in that country? How much is the health insurance? It's almost invariably cheaper than it is in the US. But you need to understand how their health system works. And if you have medical issues, or even if you don't have medical issues, you do need to understand how to access doctors. I have been sick in foreign countries before. It's very scary when you are sick in a foreign country because you don't know the system. It's often your network is going to pull you through this, but especially if you have medical issues or you may be in frail health, I definitely suggest establishing a relationship with a doctor in the foreign country. Now, sometimes the doctor will not speak English, or sometimes the doctor speaks English but just isn't confident enough to speak English with you. You may have to look for a doctor that specifically targets the expat community and that you can comfortably and confidently speak English with. or you have to have a pretty decent level of fluency in the language in order to be able to deal with the doctor that is local. Next thing, who's going to do your taxes? Just because you leave the United States doesn't mean that you aren't on the hook for taxes in the US, and you may be on the hook for taxes in a foreign country. You really do need to find an accountant that specializes in both, I don't know, Mexican and American taxation systems, or Portuguese and American taxation systems. Those people can be difficult to find. Oftentimes the expat community will guide you to the correct person, but ask yourself who's going to help you out with your taxes. Next, if you're going to buy a home, who's going to be your real estate agent? Buying a home in different countries functions in very different ways. You need to learn the ins and outs of real estate. Sometimes you're not buying real estate, you're leasing it for 99 years, or really wild things like that. You need to make sure you understand how real estate works. A trusted real estate agent that speaks English. And also, what would happen if you die in a foreign country and you have land holdings in Mexico? How does that pass to the next generation, or does that pass to the next generation? Next thing, who's going to handle your legal documents like immigration? You need to connect with a good lawyer or several good lawyers in the country, preferably someone who speaks English, but if they don't speak English, you're going to have to be able to navigate it in a foreign language. And who's going to help with medication? Oftentimes, doctors are very different from pharmacists. What some countries sell in pharmacies, we don't sell in the U.S. Drugs that go under one name here in the U.S. are a completely different name in a different country. You need to get that all sorted out, preferably before you leave the U.S. or very soon after arriving in your new home nation when you're doing geo arbitrage. So, there's a sequence of events that have to happen before you make the move abroad. Also, I say, try a part-time move to the country. Let's say you're a digital nomad or you're retired and you have freedom. Maybe take 6 months out of the year and go to the country and just see what you think. You want to try out different parts of the country. You want to try out different cities to find the community that is right for you. Pay attention to things like crime, danger. Sometimes people go to places and they're in a tourist bubble and they don't realize once you get outside of the tourist bubble, the situation really is quite dangerous. Mexico could be a good example of that. If you're in Cancun and you're in the resorts, you're fine, but you go outside of that, you go into certain areas, you may not even know that you're really putting yourself in danger, but you are really putting yourself in danger. Next thing, weather. If you go the summer of every year to this country and the weather is great and everything, winter may be hell. It may be a frozen wasteland hell, or it may be a rainy mess. But make sure you know the around the year weather pattern of where you are living. Tourism. I've spent time in Spain, in Barcelona. Summers are hellacious. I mean, it's like hordes of tourists anywhere between May and October. There's just hundreds of thousands of people, if not, it feels like millions of people sometimes, that descend on a relatively small city who are part of the tourist scene of Barcelona. And it makes it really difficult to navigate the city. Public transportation becomes difficult. Going to any of the museums or any of the bars or any of this, there is flooded with tourists. Tourism season can be really difficult in certain countries because of the influx of tourists, and you may not want to be there during the summer. You may want to be somewhere else. Also, community, like I said, you need to find your community of people. It's often going to be American expats who are living there. Look for those people, they will help you out. Also, pay a lot of attention to the political situation. There are certain places in the world that have political issues going on in the background. They're about to take a turn towards the right. They're about to vote in an authoritarian dictator. There are things that people often don't catch or often are not paying attention to in the political spectrum that can really have serious impact on their lives and their livelihoods. So pay attention to the political situation and do some research before you commit to that country. Housing. What does housing look like? Is housing incredibly expensive? Are you going to be in competition with locals for housing? How much is housing? What are the conditions of leases, of rentals, of purchases? What is the quality and condition of housing? I've lived in nations where the condition and quality of the housing was just appalling. And these are developed first world nations. You would never think that the housing situation was that terrible, but you were going to pay an arm and a leg for what probably would be considered close adjacent to slum quality here in the US, but the country just didn't have the housing stock, or just didn't have modern housing stock available. So pretty much if you wanted to live in this nation, in this city, you were going to have to settle for subpar housing that was very, very expensive. Medical system. If you have medical issues, or even if you don't have medical issues, if you experience a major medical event, can you get to a medical center? If you are out in the middle of nowhere, or there isn't a really developed medical system, you're going to have a problem. And finally, ease of return, ease of working in the US. I've had the situation where I've lived abroad for a period of time and worked out of the US. There was a 9 hour time difference between the country and the US. And it was exhausting. I was up in the middle of the night taking meetings. It was nothing to be at 3 a.m. in the morning in the country taking a meeting that was like 6 p.m. in the evening here in the US. It really wore on me in a period of time. And I was a young person. I thought I could swing with it. But, getting up at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. Several times a week for meetings, it messes with your mind and it messes with your body. So having a huge time difference when you have to be present for digital meetings can be an issue. Also, if something happens in your family here in the US, a 9 or a 12 or 24-hour flight to get back to the US may be too much for people. So some people want to consider ease of return and time zone in selecting their country. Some people select multiple countries. One year they're here, next year they're there, next year they're somewhere else. Some people make the decision to live part-time in a foreign country. They live in Spain for 6 months out of the year, and then during the summer they come back and they live in the US. That's an option. There are many ways to create this system that works for people, to give people an opportunity to take advantage of geo arbitrage, to live abroad and to have an experience, but to create it in their own way. So, there you have it, geo arbitrage. I'm a huge fan of international living myself. I've done it several times during my career and really cherished each and every opportunity. I hope someday to have an experience of retirement abroad, but there's a few things as an American that you do need to be aware of and you do need to look out for. If you found this information useful, please like, please share, and please subscribe.